Good morning. I had a few remarks that I wanted to make before I began the sermon, but now I'm afraid I'm going to cry. But I do just want to thank you for being such a wonderful church. I can't say any more than that right now because I will cry. But I'm grateful to all of you. This has been a healing place for me, and it's been a wonderful place. It's a place where I've learned so much from all of you and grown so much, and I'm so grateful. I'm grateful for the choir and that beautiful anthem this morning. Thank you so much. The church musicians here are just awesome. You have a choir, you have Ray, you have Tom. How blessed you are, and how blessed you are to have Anna and Madison. Madison has been such a wonderful pastor to me in particular, and I am just so grateful. I'm grateful that he is so gracious enough to share his pulpit from time to time, and that you have been willing to listen. And thank you. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. So, for years now, I've been finding pennies. I'm in my house and I find a penny on the floor. I'm cleaning out a box or a drawer and there's a penny. I'm walking through a store or a parking lot and I see this shiny glint of copper that pretty much cries out, "Pick me up." And I do, because I have learned something amazing about pennies. Those least valued coins that people drop and forget about, the ones that they toss and just walk away from, the ones that they put down and think I'll deal with it later is more of annoyance than anything else. These pennies are great signs of God's abundant love for us, placed in front of us so that we might offer thanksgiving to God for all of God's gifts. I'm grateful for pennies. Sure, I might have gotten the message quicker if I kept finding $20 bills, but there's something mystical about pennies. A penny here and a penny there reminds me that the divine abundance is everywhere, that the divine presence is everywhere, but I have to look for it, acknowledge it, and give thanks for it, each tiny drop at a time. Over time, I've learned to see pennies in a new way. Over time, I've learned to receive and accept divine grace in new ways too. I'm blessed, and I know it, and I give thanks for the presence of the divine every day. Writer Annie Dillard tells of times when she was a child and she'd go around hiding pennies for people to find. She'd hide them in the roots of an old tree or in the crack in the sidewalk, and then draw elaborate signs with arrows that said, "Surprise ahead," or "Money this way." Reflecting on her excitement over others finding the treasure that she had hidden, Annie Dillard, the adult, wrote this: "There are many things to see, unwrapped gifts and free surprises. The world is fairly studded and strewn with pennies, cast broadside by a generous hand. But, and this is the point, who gets excited by a mere penny? If you follow one arrow, if you crouch motionless on a bank to watch a tremulous ripple thrill on the water, and are rewarded by the sight of a muskrat paddling from its den, will you count that sight a chip of copper only and go on your rueful way? It is dire poverty indeed," Dillard writes, "when a man is so malnourished and fatigued that he won't stoop to pick up a penny. But if you cultivate a healthy poverty and simplicity so that finding a penny will literally make your day, then since the world is in fact planted in pennies, you have with your poverty bought a lifetime of days. It is that simple. What you see is what you get." Well, I doubt that Paul spent his days hunched over looking for pennies, but I do think that he innately understood in his own way to what Annie Dillard is referring. In the midst of suffering and sorrow, in the midst of struggle and pain, there are these shiny glimmers of hope and abundance, inviting us to take notice and inviting us to enter into the wonder and mystery and presence of God. Paul doesn't know what his own future holds. At the moment he writes this letter to the Philippians, he's in prison, being held on a capital crime, the penalty for which is generally death. And yet, even in the midst of this very difficult time in his own life, Paul still ministers to the church he knows and loves so well. He calls them simply to rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord. Again, I will say, rejoice. Well, when Paul tells us to rejoice, we might be tempted to say, the man just doesn't get it. The world economy is struggling. There are conflicts and wars and acts of terror happening all over the world. We are in the midst of a divisive presidential campaign. Our government appears to be in chaos. Every week we hear of mass shootings and murders, and yet the powers that be refuse to address ways to keep guns out of the hands of mass murderers. There are still ugly incidents of racism and homophobia. Closer to home, we may be struggling with illness or the illness of a loved one, grief, depression, broken relationships, the loss of a job or a home. Paul just doesn't get it. But Paul gets it better than we think. Paul's words, when you look beneath the surface, don't offer a simplistic, don't worry, be happy kind of philosophy. As he says in this text, Paul understands suffering. He has experienced times of plenty and times of need. But more important, I think, Paul understands the reality and nature of worship, prayer, and community, and how our participation in worship, prayer, and community can be life-enhancing, life-building, and life-changing. In truth, the community that we call church can be a powerful antidote to many of the ills that are infecting our society. And Paul gets it. Paul gets it. As one pastor says so eloquently, freedom from worry and grounding in joy happen in community. To be of the same mind means that the community needs to put real effort into building and maintaining relationships of real mutuality, comprehension, and compassion, which allows the prayers of the community then to take hold and become realities. Communal prayer and worship bind individuals together to form a community, and that mutual community is sustained by individual prayer, being attentive to, as Paul says, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable. Paul invites the community to keep on doing these things. And by doing so, as this pastor notes, frees the community from plaguing worries and helps it to place itself in God's hands and focus on God's desires for it. The pastor concludes, if we strive for community and mutual well-being, Paul promises us the peace of God. In other words, we may find peace and community because we may find a community like this community at Pilgrim that just gets what living the message of the gospel is all about. To live the gospel is to find joy in a community that celebrates and worships together. To live the gospel is to find comfort and challenge in a community that sees the pain and the poverty of others all around them. To live the gospel is when the church goes out to live in solidarity with the suffering, offering compassion in the face of despair and glimmers of the abundance of God in the face of material and spiritual poverty. Paul gets that, and that's what he wants to pass on to the church at Philippi. And this particular church, like this particular church in Carlsbad, is probably filled with people who are struggling, trying to make ends meet in their own lives, while trying still to do that important work of the church. And yet Paul calls them still to rejoice and to understand that God is with them in all things, at all times, and that whatever act of love and giving they offer is one more penny in the giant bucket of abundance poured out over the world by a loving and generous church, a church that lives out the incarnation every day by sharing those simple glimmers of God's constant presence and love. Now, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, if we could solve the problems of the world with one grand gesture. If I had mega millions, I could give it to those who need it the most. But let's face it, most of us are not in that position. We give our money in little bits, and we offer our acts of love and compassion as we can, maybe helping one or two individuals at a time, rather than a whole community or a whole nation. We offer our gifts 1 penny at a time, thinking that those gifts don't matter so much. But when you turn around and look behind you at the pennies that have been scattered from your hand, you might suddenly realize that you have given away a fortune in smiles, a wealth of hugs, and an entire bank full of compassion. And then it finally occurs to us that everything we do matters. Every action we take matters. Every Christ-centered, community-based act of love that comes from the deep well of our hearts makes a difference in this world. Every glimmer of God that we offer is a glimpse into the kingdom, the one Paul lives for and the one we long for, where there is peace, justice, hope, and love, not just for some of us, but for all of us. So to get to that place, Paul tells us, it takes acts of love and hope and justice, but those acts must be bolstered by a life of prayer. The peace of God, the certainty of God's presence, comes from communion with God. If we stay in communion with God, Paul tells us, then the peace of God will be with us. God is with us. It's all about the incarnation after all. God is not some distant puppet master pulling on our strings, but God is present with us on the journey. Even in the rough patches, we are never alone. God is in the pennies. The well-known preacher Thomas Long offers a story that speaks to our larger purpose in this world, a purpose that asks that our faith always be at full power. He tells about a time when he was part of a clergy team, offering listening ears and counsel to a group of university chaplains. He says, an older member of the council asked the chaplains, what are university students like morally these days? The chaplains looked at each other, wondering how to answer that question. Finally, one of them took a stab at it. Well, she said, I think you'd basically be pleased. The students are pretty ambitious in terms of their careers, but that's not all they are. A lot of them tutor kids after school. Some work in a night shelter and a soup kitchen for the homeless. The chaplain's list went on. As she talked, the Jewish chaplain who was listening to her began to grin. The more she talked, the bigger he grinned, until it finally became distracting. Am I saying something funny? She said to the Jewish chaplain. No, I'm sorry, he replied. I was just sitting here thinking. You're saying that university students are good people, and you're right. You're saying that they're involved in good social causes, and they are. But what I was thinking is that the one thing they lack is a vision of salvation. Long says we all stopped and looked at the Jewish university chaplain. No, it's true, he said. If you do not have some vision of what God is doing to repair the entire creation, you can't get up every day and work in a soup kitchen. It finally beats you down. Even as we offer our individual acts of love and compassion, God invites us to embrace the divine vision of the kingdom of love we all long for. That vision of salvation is not an individual, I've got mine, you better get yours kind of vision, but it is a vision that welcomes all people to the table, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like, no matter where they have been, no matter what they have done. It is a vision that helps us to recognize the face of God in the face of every person gathered at the table, in the face of the poor and the sick and the struggling. It is that vision of all people eating together and sharing equally at the table that can keep churches going through tough times, through lean times, through burnout times, and through all those times when the call to rejoice falls on hurting spirits. Each of you who wanted one received a penny today. I invite you to keep it somewhere special as a reminder to look for the glimmers of the divine everywhere, even in those places where you least expect to find any sign of God, even when you least feel like looking for God. As I leave this beautiful, very special church, I urge you to find and gather your pennies of hope and joy as you can, and then bring them into this place to lay them down for one another so that those who are feeling especially impoverished on any given day may find the richness and abundance of this community of faith. You are God's gifts to one another. You are the face of God to one another. You are the presence of God for one another. So like Paul, I say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. Keep the vision of the kingdom front and center. And may the God of peace and justice and truth go with you always.